The wind howled across the frozen wasteland like a living thing, hungry and merciless and desperate to claim every last spark of warmth that dared exist in its domain. And Kiara struggled forward through snow that reached past her knees each step, a battle against exhaustion and the numbing cold that seeped through her thermal suit like water through cracked stone. Her people, the Zephyri, were not built for this kind of cold, and their homeworld orbited a star that burned bright and warm where the coldest season still felt like spring on most other planets, and their bodies were lean and graceful, designed for speed and agility, not for enduring the brutal kiss of sub-zero temperatures, and Kiara could feel her limbs growing sluggish, her thoughts beginning to slow as the cold worked its way deeper into her core. The distress beacon she clutched in her four-fingered hand had long since stopped transmitting, and the small red light that once blinked with steady reassurance now sat, dark and lifeless, and she had no way of knowing if anyone had received her signal before the power cell died, and no way of knowing if help was coming, or if she would simply become another frozen corpse buried beneath the endless snow her ship lay somewhere behind her. A twisted wreck of metal and shattered dreams scattered across the mountainside where she had crashed 3 days ago, and she had salvaged what she could from the wreckage, an emergency pack, some rations, and the thermal suit that was now failing to keep her alive. And then she had started walking because staying with the wreck meant certain death, and walking at least gave her a chance. However, Slim Kiara stumbled and fell forward into the snow, and the impact drove the breath from her lungs, and for a long moment she simply lay there, feeling the cold press against her face like a lover's hand, gentle and terrible, and she thought about how easy it would be to simply close her eyes and let the darkness take her, and how the pain and the fear would finally end. But something deep inside her refused to give up, and some stubborn spark of survival that her ancestors had passed down through countless generations, and she pushed herself back to her feet, her muscles screaming in protest and her breath coming in ragged gasps, and she took another step forward, and then another. The snow began to fall harder, now thick flakes that swirled around her in dizzying patterns and reduced visibility to barely a few meters, and Kiara could no longer see the mountains in the distance or the gray sky above. And she was alone in a world of white and cold and endless suffering. Her thoughts began to wander, drifting like the snow around her, and she remembered her home, the warm stone walls of her family dwelling, and the garden where blue flowers grew in wild profusion. And she remembered her sister's laugh, bright and musical, and the way their mother would hum old songs while preparing the evening meal, and she remembered why she had left and the burning desire to explore the galaxy, and to see worlds beyond her own, and to prove that the Zephyri were more than just another species content to stay within their own borders. And she had trained for years to become a scout and had finally earned her ship and her chance to venture into the unknown. And this was where it had led her, to a frozen death on a planet whose name she did not even know. Kiara fell again, and this time she could not find the strength to rise, and she lay in the snow, feeling the cold seep into her bones, and the darkness gathering at the edges of her vision. And she wondered if anyone would ever find her body, or if she would simply disappear beneath the snow and be forgotten. And then she heard something, a sound that cut through the howling wind and penetrated the fog that was settling over her mind. And it was a voice calling out in a language she did not understand, and footsteps crunching through the snow growing closer. She tried to lift her head, tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, and her body refused to obey her commands, and she could only lie there helpless as the footsteps came closer and closer. And then he was there, and a figure dressed in thick furs and insulated clothing looming over her like a mountain, and she could not see his face through the snow and the darkness creeping across her vision. But she could see his eyes, and they were bright with concern and determination. The human knelt beside her, and she knew he was human because she had studied the species during her training and had learned about their physical characteristics and their remarkable ability to adapt to almost any environment. And he was large, much larger than any Zephyri, with broad shoulders and powerful limbs and a face that was weathered by exposure to harsh conditions. He was speaking to her, his voice urgent, but she could not understand the words, and her translator had been damaged in the crash and lay useless in the wreckage of her ship. And she tried to respond, tried to tell him that she needed help. But all that came out was a weak sound that was lost in the wind, and then he did something she did not expect, and he removed his outer coat. the thick fur-lined garment that was protecting him from the cold, and he wrapped it around her and pulled her close against his chest. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming, and Kiara felt it seep into her frozen body like sunlight. After a long night, and the human's body heat radiated through the coat and into her core and began to drive back the numbness that had claimed her limbs, and she pressed closer to him instinctively, seeking more of that precious warmth. He lifted her easily as if she weighed nothing at all, and cradled her against his chest and began walking through the snow. And his steps were sure and steady, despite the burden he carried, and the blizzard that raged around them, and Kiara could feel the rise and fall of his breathing and the steady beat of his heart against her cheeks. He tried to stay conscious, tried to focus on where they were going, but the warmth and the exhaustion combined to pull her down into darkness. And the last thing she remembered was the feeling of safety and the knowledge that she was no longer alone. When Kiara woke, she was lying on something soft and warm, and there was a fire crackling nearby. An orange light danced across rough stone walls, and she blinked, slowly trying to remember where she was and how she had gotten here. The memories came back in fragments, and the crash and the cold and the endless walking, and then the human who had found her and wrapped her in his coat and carried her to safety. Sat up slowly, and her body ached in a dozen places, but the bone-deep cold was gone, replaced by a comfortable warmth, and she looked around and found herself in a small cave, and the entrance was blocked by a makeshift barrier of stones and fabric that kept out the wind and the snow. The human was sitting near the fire tending to a small pot that hung over the flames, and he looked up when she moved, and their eyes met. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. He was younger than she had thought, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s by human standards, and his face was lean and angular with a strong jaw and a straight nose, and his eyes were a deep brown that reflected the firelight, and his hair was dark and slightly too long, falling across his forehead in unruly waves. He said something in his language and gestured to the pot, and Kiara understood that he was offering her food, and her stomach clenched at the thought, and she realized she had not eaten in more than a day. She nodded and tried to speak, but her throat was dry and raw, and only a croak came out, and the human quickly grabbed a container and brought it to her, and she drank gratefully, and the water was cold and clean and tasted better than anything she could remember. The human returned to the fire and ladled some of the pot's contents into a bowl and brought it to her, and she accepted it with both hands and looked down at the steaming liquid, and it appeared to be some kind of soup or stew, with chunks of meat and vegetables floating in a rich broth. She tasted it cautiously, and the flavor was strong and unfamiliar, but not unpleasant, and the warmth spread through her body as she ate, and she realized how hungry she had been, and she finished the bowl quickly, and the human smiled and refilled it without being asked. They sat in silence for a while, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside the cave, and Kiara studied her rescuer and tried to understand why he had helped her. Humans were known throughout the galaxy as a strange and contradictory species, and they were capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty, often at the same time. And they were warriors and explorers and artists and scientists, and they seemed driven by emotions that other species found difficult to understand. But this human had risked his own life to save hers, and had given up his coat to keep her warm, and had brought her to shelter and fed her and asked for nothing in return. And Kiara felt a surge of gratitude that transcended the language barrier between them. She set down the empty bowl and placed her hand over her heart, and bowed her head in the traditional Zephyri gesture of thanks, and the human watched her with curious eyes, and then he smiled and returned the gesture awkwardly, placing his hand over his own heart, and in that moment, a connection formed between them and something that went beyond words or culture or species, and it was the simple recognition of one living being helping another, and the acknowledgement that kindness was a universal language. The human stood and moved to a corner of the cave, and returned with a bundle of furs and blankets, and he spread them out near the fire and gestured for Kiara to lie down, and she did so gratefully, and her body still ached from the ordeal she had endured. He covered her with another blanket and tucked it around her shoulders, and then he settled himself on the other side of the fire, and wrapped his own coat around himself, and leaned back against the cave wall. Kiara watched him through half-closed eyes and saw the exhaustion written across his face and the way his shoulders sagged with weariness. And she realized that he must be tired too, and that he had probably been traveling or hunting when he found her, and had given up his own rest and comfort to care for her. She wanted to thank him properly and to tell him how much his kindness meant to her, but the language barrier made it impossible, and so she simply watched him and memorized the details of his face, and promised herself that if she survived this, she would find a way to repay him. Sleep claimed her again and pulled her down into dreams of home and warmth and safety. When she woke again, the fire had burned low, and the cave was dim and filled with shadows, and the human was still asleep on the other side of the fire, and his coat had slipped from his shoulders and his face was peaceful in slumber. Kiara sat up carefully and tried not to make any noise, and she looked around the cave and saw that it was larger than she had first thought, and it extended back into darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. And there were signs that the human had been living here for some time, and a neat stack of firewood and various supplies organized along one wall, and even a few primitive tools. She stood slowly and her legs were unsteady beneath her but stronger than they had been, and she made her way to the cave entrance and peered through a gap in the barrier. The storm had passed, and the world outside was transformed into a landscape of pure white and untouched snow stretched as far as she could see, and glittered in the pale sunlight. And the sky above was a clear crystalline blue, and the mountains in the distance stood sharp and magnificent against the horizon. It was beautiful and breathtaking in a way that reminded Kiara why she had wanted to explore the galaxy, and why she had left the safety of her homeworld. And every planet had its own unique beauty and its own wonders to discover. And even this frozen wasteland had a stark magnificence that stirred something in her soul. She heard movement behind her and turned to see the human awake and watching her. And he stood and came to the entrance and looked out at the snow-covered landscape and said something in his language. Kiara wished desperately that she could understand him and could communicate with him beyond simple gestures. And she pointed to herself and said her name slowly and clearly. Hoping he would understand Kiara, she repeated, and tapped her chest. The human's eyes lit with understanding, and he pointed to himself and spoke his own name. And it sounded like something close to Alex, or perhaps Alec, and Kiara tried to repeat it, and he smiled and nodded. Alex, she said. And he grinned and pointed at her. Kiara, he said, and his pronunciation was rough but recognizable. It was a start and a first bridge across the gap that separated them. Over the following days, they developed a routine, and Alex would venture out into the snow to hunt and gather firewood while Kiara recovered her strength. And each time he returned, he brought back meat or edible plants, and once even a cluster of pale berries that tasted sweet and tangy. Kiara helped where she could, and tending the fire, and preparing the food as best she could with her limited knowledge of human cooking. And Alex taught her through gestures and demonstrations, and showed her which plants were safe to eat, and which would make her sick, and how to skin and prepare the small animals he caught. They began to learn each other's languages and a handful of words and phrases that allowed for basic communication. And Kiara learned that Alex had been living in the mountains for several months, and that he was some kind of researcher or scientist studying the local ecology. And he had been alone when he found Alex learned that Kiara was from another world, and that her ship had crashed and that she had no way to contact her people or call for rescue, and he seemed troubled by this and spent long hours staring into the fire with a thoughtful expression. One evening as they sat by the fire, and Kiara noticed Alex drawing something in the dirt, and she moved closer and saw that he was sketching a crude map, and he pointed to a spot in the center and then to the cave around them. Here, he said, and then he moved his finger across the map to another spot and spoke a word she did not know and repeated it several times. Station, he said finally, and pointed in a direction beyond the cave and made a gesture that suggested distance. Kiara understood, and there was some kind of human settlement or research station somewhere in the mountains, and perhaps a place with communication equipment and a way to call for help. How far, she asked, and using the few words of his language she had learned and supplementing with gestures. Alex held up his hands and spread them wide, and then brought them together, and then apart again, and he was trying to show her a significant distance and perhaps several days of travel. Kiara felt hope surge in her chest and mingled with anxiety. And the journey would be dangerous, especially in winter conditions, but it was a chance, and the possibility of rescue, and of returning home. She pointed to herself and then to the map and then made a walking gesture and looked at Alex questioningly. He shook his head firmly and pointed at her and then at the ground and made a staying gesture. And then he pointed to himself and to the map and made a walking gesture. He wanted her to stay here while he went to the station alone. Kiara protested and gesturing emphatically and trying to make him understand that she could make the journey and that she was stronger now and that she did not want him to go alone. But Alex was adamant, and he pointed to her thin frame and to the snow outside, and shook his head, and he was right, and she knew it, and her body was not built for extended travel in this climate, and she would slow him down and possibly endanger them both. Finally, she nodded reluctantly and accepted his decision, and Alex smiled and reached out and squeezed her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. "Tomorrow," he said, and pointed to himself, and then to the map, and then he mimed sleeping and held up 2 fingers. 2 days and he would be gone for 2 days. Kiara spent a restless night and tossing and turning on her bed of furs and worrying about Alex and wondering what would happen if he did not return, and she told herself that he had survived in these mountains for months and that he knew the terrain and the dangers. But fear gnawed at her nonetheless. In the morning, Alex prepared for his journey, and he gathered supplies and filled a pack with food and water and extra furs, and he checked his equipment methodically and made sure everything was secure. Before he left, he showed Kiara where everything was stored, and he pointed out the food supplies and the water containers and the firewood, and he mimed what to do if the fire went out and how to use the flint and steel he left with her. Then he pointed to the cave entrance and made a locking gesture and shook his head firmly, and he did not want her to leave the cave while he was gone. Kiara nodded and understood the wisdom in this, and if she got lost or injured while he was away, they would both be in danger. Alex hesitated at the entrance and turned back to look at her, and for a moment their eyes met, and something passed between them, and an unspoken understanding and a connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. "Be safe," she said in his language, and the words awkward but sincere. Alex smiled, and "You too," he replied in her language and equally awkward. Then he was gone, and disappearing into the white landscape beyond the cave, and Kiara was alone. The first day passed slowly, and Kiara kept herself busy by maintaining the fire and organizing the supplies and exploring the deeper reaches of the cave by firelight. And she found evidence of Alex's long occupation and a sleeping area, with carefully arranged furs and a small collection of rocks and plants he had apparently been studying, and even a journal filled with notes and sketches in his language. She studied the journal and trying to decipher the meaning behind the drawings, and she saw detailed illustrations of local plants and animals and pages of observations and calculations, and it was clear that Alex was intelligent and methodical and deeply curious about the world around him. Night fell and Kiara lay in her bed of furs and listened to the wind outside, and the silence of the cave felt oppressive, and she found herself straining to hear any sound and any indication that Alex was returning. She thought about her own people and wondered if they were searching for her and if they had received her distress signal before the beacon died, and her family would be worried and her sister would be devastated, and she felt a pang of homesickness so sharp it was almost physical. But she also thought about Alex and about his kindness and his strength, and the way he had risked everything to save her life, and she had known him for only a few days. But already she felt a bond with him and something deeper than gratitude. The second day was harder, and Kiara found herself pacing the cave and checking the entrance repeatedly, and watching for any sign of Alex's return, and the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness as evening approached and the light outside began to fade. She felt panic beginning to rise in her chest, and what if something had happened to Alex? And what if he was injured or lost? And what if he never came back? She forced herself to sit by the fire and to breathe slowly and deeply, and to push back the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. And Alex had said 2 days, and it had not been 2 full days yet, and she needed to have faith in him. Darkness fell, and Kiara added wood to the fire and wrapped herself in blankets, and tried to sleep, but rest would not come, and she lay awake and staring at the cave entrance and willing Alex to return. And then she heard it, and the sound of footsteps crunching through snow, and a voice calling out. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the entrance and pulled aside the barrier, and there he was, and Alex stumbling toward the cave, and his face pale with exhaustion, and his clothes crusted with ice. Kiara rushed to help him, and wrapped her arm around his waist and helped him inside, and he was shaking with cold and his lips were blue, and she realized he had pushed himself to the limit. to return to her. She guided him to the fire and helped him remove his frozen outer layers, and then she wrapped him in every blanket and fur she could find and held him close and trying to share her warmth with him, just as he had done for her. Alex's teeth chattered, and he tried to speak, but the words came out garbled and incoherent, and Kiara shushed him gently and made him drink warm water and fed him small pieces of dried meat until some color returned to his face. Gradually the shaking subsided and Alex's breathing steadied, and he looked at her with grateful eyes and reached up to touch her face with one trembling hand. "Thank you," he whispered. Kiara caught his hand and held it between both of hers and warmed it with her own body. "Heat and no," she said. "And thank you." They sat together by the fire and wrapped in blankets and holding each other, and outside the wind began to howl again and another storm moving in. But they were safe and they were together, and that was all that mattered. When Alex had recovered enough to speak, he told her what he had learned, and his words mixed with gestures and the few phrases of her language he knew. And Kiara pieced together the story. He had reached the research station and found it abandoned, and the other humans had evacuated weeks ago when the winter storms became too severe, and the communication equipment was still functional. And Alex had sent out a distress signal with Kiara's coordinates and a request for rescue. Someone had responded and a ship was coming, but the storms made it impossible to predict when they would arrive, and it could be days or even weeks before a rescue was possible. Kiara felt a mixture of relief and disappointment, and she was grateful that help was coming. But the thought of leaving and of saying goodbye to Alex filled her with unexpected sadness. They spent the following days waiting, and the storms came and went, and each day they grew closer and their communication improved as they taught each other more words and more phrases, and they began to share stories about their lives and their worlds. Alex told her about Earth and about vast oceans and towering cities and forests so dense you could walk for days without seeing the sky. And he told her about his work and his passion for understanding alien ecosystems and his dream of building bridges between species. Kiara told him about her homeworld and about crystal spires that caught the sunlight and gardens that bloomed year-round, and the great songs her people sang to celebrate the turning of seasons. And she told him about her family and her desire to explore and her determination to prove herself. And as they talked, they discovered that despite their differences and despite coming from worlds separated by vast distances, and they shared the same hopes and fears and dreams, and they both wanted to make a difference and to connect with others and to find meaning in the vast universe. One evening as they sat by the fire, and Kiara found herself studying Alex's profile and the strong line of his jaw, and the way the firelight caught in his eyes, and she realized with a start that what she felt for him had grown beyond gratitude or friendship. It was something deeper, and something that transcended species and culture, and it was a connection of souls and the recognition of kindred spirits who had found each other against impossible odds. She reached out and placed her hand on his, and Alex turned to look at her, and his expression was soft and questioning. "I am glad you found me," she said slowly and carefully in his language. Alex smiled and turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "And me too," he replied in her language. They sat in comfortable silence and hands intertwined, and both knowing that their time together was drawing to a close, but neither wanting to acknowledge it. 3 days later the sky cleared, and in the distance they heard the sound of engines, and Alex and Kiara stood at the cave entrance and watched as a ship descended through the atmosphere, and its hull gleaming in the sunlight. Kiara felt her hearts clench, and she had 2 hearts as all Zephyri did, and she was about to leave and about to return to her own people and her own world. But a part of her wanted to stay and wanted to remain here with Alex in this small cave that had become more of a home than she expected. The ship landed in a clearing not far from the cave, and a group of figures emerged, and Kiara recognized the uniform of the Zephyri. Exploration fleet, and relief and sadness warred within. Alex helped her gather her few belongings in the emergency pack from her crashed ship and the thermal suit she had been wearing. And then they walked together through the snow toward the waiting ship. The rescue team rushed forward and surrounding Kiara and asking questions in rapid-fire Zephyri and checking her for injuries, and she answered mechanically, and her eyes on Alex, who stood back and watched with an unreadable expression. One of the team members, and a medical officer named Solara, pulled Kiara aside and examined her quickly. "And you are lucky to be alive," she said. "And the cold should have killed you. A human saved me." Kiara replied and gestured toward Alex Alara, looked at him with surprise and a human. And she made it sound unlikely and almost impossible, yes, Kiara said firmly, and he risked his life for mine. Solara nodded slowly. And then we owe him a debt, she said, and I will make sure this is noted in my report. Kiara left Solara and walked back to Alex, and the rescue team was preparing to depart, and they were eager to leave before another storm moved in. Alex looked at her and his expression was sad but accepting. And take care of yourself, he said. Kiara felt tears prick at her eyes, and an unusual reaction for her species, but she had learned, during her time with Alex, that humans cried when overwhelmed by emotion, and perhaps she had picked up the habit. Come with me, she said suddenly, and the woe, RDS tumbling out before she could think about them, and come to my world and meet my people. And you wanted to build bridges between species, and this could be your chance. Alex looked startled and then thoughtful, and he glanced at the ship, and then back at her. And you are serious, he asked. Yes, she said, and I am serious, and I do not want to say goodbye. Alex smiled, in that warm, genuine smile that had become so familiar and okay. He said, and yes, and I will come with you. Kiara felt joy surge through her, and she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the ship, and the rescue team looked surprised, but no one objected when Alex climbed aboard with her as the ship lifted off, and Kiara looked out the viewport at the frozen landscape falling away. Below, in the cave where she had spent the most important days of her life, was already disappearing into the distance. Alex stood beside her, and his hand in hers, and together they watched the planet shrink to a point of light and then disappear. As the ship entered hyperspace, the journey to Kiara's homeworld took several days, and during that time Alex met the rest of the crew, and they were fascinated by him and asked endless questions about Earth and human culture. And Alex answered patiently, and with good humor Kiara acted as translator, and her language skills improving rapidly as she was immersed in constant communication, and she found herself enjoying the role of bridge between her people and this human who had saved her life. When they finally arrived at Zephyra and Kiara's homeworld, Alex stood at the viewport and stared in wonder at the planet below, and it was beautiful, and with swirling clouds of pink and gold and vast oceans that glittered like jewels and continents covered in lush vegetation. They landed at the capital spaceport, and Kiara's family was waiting, and her sister ran forward and threw her arms around Kiara and sobbed with relief, and their mother and father embraced her tightly and murmured thanks. To the ancestors, Kiara introduced Alex to her family and explained what he had done, and her parents looked at him with gratitude and respect, and her sister looked at him with open curiosity. You saved my daughter's life, Kiara's father said through Kiara's translation, and our family owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Alex bowed in the human gesture of respect. And I did what anyone would do, he said. And Kiara would have done the same for me. Kiara's mother smiled. And you are welcome in our home for as long as you wish to stay, she said. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity, and Alex was given quarters in the family dwelling, and he spent his days learning about Zephyri culture and studying the local ecology and giving lectures at the Scientific Academy about human biology and Earth's ecosystems. Kiara accompanied him everywhere and serving as his guide and translator, and they became a familiar sight in the city, and the tall human and the slender Zephyri walking side by side through the crystal gardens in the market square. People talked, of course, and the relationship between a human and a Zephyri was unusual, and some found it strange, but most were simply curious and interested in this alien who had come to their world and who treated everyone with kindness and respect. Kiara found herself falling deeper in love with Alex, and with each passing day, and she loved the way he looked at the world with wonder and curiosity, and the way he treated every living thing with gentleness, and the way he made her laugh with his awkward attempts at Zephyri humor. And she thought Alex felt the same way, and she saw it in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, and in the way he always sought her out in a crowded room, and in the way his hand would find hers without conscious thought. But neither of them spoke of it, and perhaps afraid that putting it into words would make it too real and too impossible. One evening, Kiara took Alex to her favorite place in a cliff overlooking the city, where you could see the entire valley spread out below, and the lights of 1,000,000 homes twinkling like stars. They sat on the edge, and their legs dangling over the drop, and watched the twin moons rise over the horizon. "This is beautiful," Alex said, and his voice soft with awe. Kiara looked at him and nodded the view, and yes, she agreed. Alex turned to face her and seemed to read something in her expression. "And Kiara," he said, "and there is something I need to tell you." Her hearts began to race, and yes, she said, "I have been offered a position here." Alex said, "And at the Scientific Academy, and they want me to stay and to teach and to help establish cultural exchange programs with Earth." Kiara felt hope bloom in her chest, "And that is wonderful," she said. Alex nodded, "But there is more." He continued, "And I wanted to accept. But I needed to talk to you first because the reason I want to stay is not just the work. And it is you, and I want to stay because I cannot imagine leaving you." Kiara felt tears well up again, and "Alex," she whispered, "I love you." Alex said in the words simple and direct and human, "And I know we come from different worlds and that this is complicated. But I love you, and I needed you to know." Kiara laughed in a sound that was half sob. "And I love you too," she said. "And I have loved you since you wrapped me in your coat and carried me through the snow, and I thought I was going to die, and you gave me life." Alex reached up and cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, and it was gentle and tender and full of promise. And Kiara wrapped her arms around him and held him close, and knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for. They sat together, on the cliff as the night deepened around them, and two beings from different worlds who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and who had chosen to build a life together despite all the obstacles. And in the city below, the lights continued to twinkle, and somewhere in the distance someone was singing an old Zephyri song about love and hope and new beginnings. And Kiara listened to the melody and smiled and leaned against Alex, and felt completely at peace. Their story became legend on Zephyra, and the tale of the human who saved the Zephyri scout, and the love that grew between them. And it was told in songs and stories and passed down through generations as an example of the bonds that could form between species when they opened their hearts to one another. Alex and Kiara spent the rest of their lives together, and Alex teaching at the academy and writing papers about interspecies cooperation, and Kiara continuing her work as a scout, but never venturing far from home. And they had a family and a blending of two cultures that created something entirely new and beautiful. And on cold winter nights when the snow fell on Zephyra's northern regions, and Kiara would hold Alex close and remember that frozen wasteland where they had first met, and she would thank whatever fate or chance or divine intervention had brought them together. Because sometimes the universe brought two souls together in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes the greatest love. Stories began with a simple act of kindness and a willingness to risk everything for a stranger. And sometimes being wrapped in someone's arms when you were freezing to death was not just about physical warmth, but about the warmth of connection and compassion and love that could transcend any barrier. The end.